Hi guys, welcome to my tutorial on how to set up PlayFab with your multiplayer game. Today we're going to be talking about PlayFab's multiplayer server service, which is essentially going to allow you to host your dedicated server. The first step to that naturally is to ensure that your game server build with PlayFab integrated can actually work locally, after which we can actually deploy them. Let's get started. To begin, this is the repository we'll be looking at to use as our reference for this entire tutorial. So if you see here, you need the PlayFab Game Server SDK and also the PlayFab Unity SDK. So if I head over to this project, which is the Unity SDK, a quick way to download this is to actually go into PlayFab Unity editor extensions. So if I click on this, you will see that I get a download, which is the editor extension. So here you can see that I have a simple Unity project set up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to assets, I'm going to import package, custom package, and I'm going to get in the PlayFab editor extension. So I'm going to hit import. And you can see that the editor extension was added. The first thing you see here is it actually asks you to create an account if you don't have one on PlayFab already. Now I have an account, so I'm going to click on login and I'm going to actually log into my account. So I'm going to pause the recording here and continue in just a moment. Before we move on, this is what the PlayFab dashboard looks like. So you can go ahead and create a new studio here as well as create a new game title. So for the purpose of this video, I've created a new title called PlayFab Tutorial, which gives you a title ID as well, which we'll be using in just a moment. So if I get back to the editor after the extension is downloaded, you can see here that now I'm in and it says no SDK is installed. So I'm going to quickly hit install. Now that that's done, you can see here it says the SDK, the latest version is installed. I can head over to settings and it says here that I can choose my studio. And here I've selected the title ID as PlayFab tutorial, right? So make sure you do not show this developer secret key to anybody else, but yeah. So the next thing you need is the PlayFab Game Server SDK, also known as the GSDK. So if I open this in a new tab, you can see this is a little more complicated. There's no straightforward download. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to clone this repository. And if you see here inside the SDK folder, there is a folder called Multiplayer Agent. This folder needs to be added within your PlayFab SDK folder in your game, and then you have access to the GSDK. After cloning the project, I grabbed the multiplayer agent folder and I've dragged it all the way into my tutorials folder. So in the PlayFab SDK, so you can see that the folder now is here. And if I go into my Unity project, this folder is now under PlayFab SDK. So this confirms that I have access to the GSDK as well. There's one more step to enable the Unity GSDK, which is I need to add this directive enable PlayFab server API in my build settings. So I can quickly head over to build settings. I can go into my player settings, and if I scroll down all the way, you can see that I have scripting defined symbols. And within these, I can click on plus here and I can paste my PlayFab server API define and I can click on apply. So the other thing I want to do is add my scene into the scenes in build, and I also want to change my target platform to Linux, architecture set to x86-64, and also enable server build. So I'm quickly going to show you how this plays out before we move on to the next steps. So I can connect here and I can join as a host where I serve as a server and a client, and you can see that I can move around, right? This is what the game looks like. And I can also connect from another client. I'm using parallel sync for this, by the way. I can connect as another client here, and you can see that the movement is perfectly synced, right? So if I move this client, everything works as intended. All right, so now we're going to start integrating PlayFab's GSDK and their regular SDK into our scripts so that we can actually use it. So let's go ahead and create a folder called scripts. And within this folder, I'm going to create two scripts. One is an agent listener, which I will tell you what it is in just a moment. And the other script I'm going to create is a Unity network server. So there's a little lag here, but yeah. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go back to the repository, right, of the sample. Go to Unity server, go to assets, go to server and scripts here, and you can see here that there are copies of these two scripts. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to copy paste the agent listener into my editor of choice. And I'm going to explain these in just a moment, right? But before that, I'm also going to copy the Unity network server. Right. So walking through these scripts really quick, the only compulsory bits here are the PlayFab multiplayer agent API.start and this ready for players method call, which is calling the multiplayer agent API is ready for players method. This is the bare minimum you'll need for the GSDK to actually successfully integrate with your server. The rest of what's written here is just you subscribing to a few callbacks. For example, what happens when the server shuts down, what happens when the server gets active. And you can see here that all I'm doing is just, printing some statements or, what the example does. And when the server is active, it also starts listening on the Unity network server, which I'll explain in a moment. And the rest of the callbacks are pretty straightforward and it's not necessary for you to get up and running. Again, to reiterate, line 15 and line 25 here are the most important. Now, moving to Unity network server, this is just inheriting the network manager. So this is going to be a new network manager. You don't need max connections and port here. So, and you can listen on to max connections coming from the parent, right? In this case will be 4 by default. All the other methods here that are written are just events that you're subscribing to. So for example, what happens on the server when a new client connects, right? So ideally you add them to a list of connections so that you can actually use it later. And you can see here that that's precisely what is happening. So the next step is actually to get both of these scripts into our hierarchy. So I'm going to create an empty game object, call it Unity network server. And I'm going to attach this script. And also I am going to add a network manager hard. And because I'm doing this, I cannot use a secondary network manager. So I'm going to get rid of this. I'll actually just remove this entirely, right? And I'm going to go to my prefab, set my player prefab here, and make sure you have run in background enabled and auto start server build also enabled, and make sure your port is 7777 or whatever the number is. Just make sure you keep a track of what that number is, right? I'm going to create a child game object here. So I'm going to say create empty and I'm going to call this agent listener and I'm going to attach my agent listener script. And if I actually click play now, you can see here that I get 2 errors, right? Which says GSTK config file not defined and null reference here in the multiplayer agent API. Now this is expected. These errors are thrown when you're not in a headless server build because your GSTK cannot actually talk to your game server, right? So this is expected in your editor mode. What I want to do next is actually build my game server so then I can actually containerize it. So I'm just going to quickly create a new folder, call it PlayFab test image. I will tell you why image in a moment. I create another folder here called game. And then I can go back to my editor, go to build settings, Linux x86 64. My scene in build is on here and I can hit build and I can do this in my PlayFab test image and inside game. And I'm going to call this file Unity server. So what we're going to be doing next, as you can see here, the game server is already built, is we're going to be creating a Docker file, right? So I'm in my directory where I have my game here, and I'm just going to quickly do touch Docker file, and I'm going to open this in a code editor of my choice, right? And here, I'm going to paste the following code, right? Which is I want Ubuntu version 18. I'm going to add dot dot and I'm going to run this command when my image runs as a container, which is this server build and no graphics and in batch mode, right? So before we move on, I'm just going to quickly explain what Docker is and why it's needed here. So PlayFab, especially when you're using Linux for your server builds, you can only run it in Linux containers, which means you are pretty much forced to use something like Docker or Podman. Containerization is a concept where you take a bunch of software or code plus its dependencies and you package them into a box, right? Or in this case, a container. And essentially it can run anywhere because it always is aware of what dependencies it needs, etc., etc. And anytime you need to make any updates to that, you can always go ahead and create a new image with, or the same image but with a different tag, right? So that's Docker in a nutshell. There are a ton of resources online on the basics of Docker. I'm not going to go in depth, but essentially this is what my Docker file is going to be doing. Now you can see here that I have Docker desktop on my system and I am already in Linux containers. When it says switch to Windows containers, that means I'm already using Linux containers. I already have a couple of them here, but that doesn't matter. What I'm going to be doing now is I'm actually going to be building an image, a Docker image, which uses this game server we just created, right? So I'm going to do docker build /t. Now /t represents the tag that I want to use. I'm going to give a registry name, which is my registry.io, it's just a random name. And I'm going to say PlayFab test colon 0.1, which is my version in this case. And dot represents the fact that I want to build an image with all the contents in this folder. Right. So you can see that finished. And if I do docker images, you can see that I have a new image called my registry.io /playfab test. It's now time to explain how we test PlayFab locally to see if everything's working. So you can see here that you need something known as the local multiplayer agent, which PlayFab basically provides you, so you can enable local debugging and check if everything works. And the way it works is it has a VM agent, right, which actually talks to your game server build by virtue of creating a Docker network. And once you start the executable that they give you, it runs your image as a container, and then you can actually connect to it from your client and you can test to see if everything works. You can grab the latest release of the MPS agent here under releases, and once you extract it, this is basically how the folder looks, right? I'm in local multiplayer agent publish. The three key files here essentially are this setup file. If you run the setup file, which I already have, it creates a Docker network for you through which your GSTK communicates with your game server build. And if I quickly show you what that looks like, you can see here that I already have a network called PlayFab and it's of type bridge, right? So this is what allows my Linux container to talk to the GSTK, right? And the second thing is your local multiplayer agent.exe. This is what basically takes your image and starts it up as a container so that you can actually connect and test if everything is working locally. But that's the last step. The next thing we're going to be looking at is multiplayer settings.json. Now this is the file where you have to make a couple of changes to ensure that everything works as intended. So let's get right to it. So this is the descriptor file, which essentially tells the exe, the multiplayer agent.exe, how it's supposed to start the image as a container. There are a couple of key properties here. One is the port mappings list. The node port is the client facing port. That's the one the client is supposed to connect to. The game port is the internal port, right, which maps internally, which is why we put 7777 as the game port on our network manager. Then you have this property called container start parameters, which tells or which says exactly what image details are. So remember we named our image PlayFab test, and in this registry, which is my registry.io, and the tag is 0.1, right? So these are essentially the three main properties that you will have to keep track of when you are building your container. Note that for this approach, you don't actually need a start game command outside or in container start parameters. This is because you are using containers, and in the image itself, in the Docker file, we specified that when the image starts, you want to run the Linux game server build. So you don't actually need to specify it here. It's optional. We're finally at the phase where we can actually demo what we worked on. So I have an administrator version of PowerShell opened here, and I'm in the folder where I've set up my multiplayer agent. So I'm going to just zoom in on this. And here I'm actually going to run my agent.exe file, and I'm going to specify the flag lcow, which is Linux container on Windows. So this is going to make sure that it runs this agent, provided that you are using Linux containers. So I'm going to hit play. And you can see here that if it comes to standing by, that your GSTK integration is working correctly, right? And this is going to keep going. And I have my client open here. And once this current game state moves to active, I can actually connect to my client. So I'm going to change my client's IP to this, the connecting IP, the network address. And I'm going to change the port to what we specified as the node port in the multiplayer settings.json. And I'm going to hit client. And you can see I'm in my game. So now I'm going to demo connecting with two clients. So I've already set up my client, the IP address to be my 127.0.0.1 and my node port to be 56100. So I'm going to connect with this client. You can see I'm in the game. And I also have another editor open here using parallel sync. So I'm quickly going to connect with this client as well. And you can see my client drops in. So this is working as intended. This is connected to a local instance of working PlayFab. And yeah. That's about it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed watching this as much as I did making it. The next video will be about actually uploading your Linux build onto PlayFab's cloud servers. So there'll be an extra bit of configuration that's required there. But this is the basic local setup you'll need as a prerequisite to actually get PlayFab working on Linux containers. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.